for the beloved and hated Impenetrable Thorns. It has been nerfed on patch 113, and it's something that we actually did see coming. It's something that we were expecting. So in today's video I'm going to show you how the build works now, how it is, and things like that. But let's talk about the changes, because I think that's the most important thing of everything. That's what you need to have in mind to consider if you're going to continue using this build. But also with the gameplay that you'll have in the background, you will see that it's still very effective. That's the thing. It's effective, it's not broken anymore. So they balanced it to some extent. They not only nerfed it completely, they did some changes around here and there for it to be a little bit more balanced and still viable. The major change is that, for example, all of the trails that the enemy, that the cast has, they drag the enemy. So it's very viable now to use it from a far away distance, as you will see me doing right here. If you have, for example, the Mimic tier, or you're playing co-op with your friends, it's an excellent option for a faraway caster, which usually prior to patch that was not the case, because the Thorns would spread up in between two different places, and only the first one, the middle one, would be the one that would be following the enemy. Now, what's the issue? It can still cast instant bleeding on the enemy. The problem is that prior to patch, if you were using it point blank shotgun on the enemy, the bleeding would happen thrice at the same time, like one bleeding proc for each one of the trails that you have. Now the bleeding build-up has been drastically decreased. It used to be 72 bleed build-up without buffing the character properly. It has been, well, without having Arcane, it has been decreased by a base of 17. Hence, that's why sometimes you require a little bit to cast and all of them to connect, especially depending on the resistances and not resistances of the enemies, for it to actually cause a bleeding. But then again, more often than not, you are still going to have the insta bleeding. It's just that it's not going to be 3 times insta bleeding as it used to be. The only benefit that we have right now is that you can cast it from far away and it's still going to track the enemy, so it's a little bit more viable to use it from a safe distance. It's still going to have sometimes insta bleeding. The base damage of the spell has also been nerfed. The original base damage that the spell had without the stat scaling, the spell sorcery scaling, it would be 125. It has been decreased to 63. And yes, it has magic damage. Everything that we're going to be using and doing in this build is going to be to increase the damage of our build right here, because it not only deals bleeding damage, yes, that's the most important thing of everything, but it also has very decent magic base damage that you can scale by using certain talismans that we're going to have right here. So those are all of the changes that they did. Logically, this is a build that works better for a higher level character. For 150, it's still very viable. It's still very doable, but we're using the maternal staff, which is going to increase our sorcery scaling, meaning the base damage of the spell. That's how it works. It has divided damage. It has the base damage of the spell, and it also has the bleeding damage, which is going to be percentage based on the enemy that you are fighting against. That being said, the fate requirement for the spell is going to be 24. The staff that we're using requires 21 intelligence, and then endurance, we don't need endurance because we're mainly going to be spamming this thing. It barely uses any kind of stamina, and we're going to be doing it from a distance. The armor set that we're going to be using doesn't require that much stamina, and it doesn't require that much mind as well, because more often than not things are going to die faster before we run out of FP points. So there's that. Everything else goes into Arcane. Logically, if you're a higher level character, for example, you can have 80 intelligence, 80 arcane. If you're one of those very high level characters, a little bit more of mind and vigor, those are the points where you're going to be focusing yourself if you want to increase your survivability and also the base damage. But this, as you can see in gameplay, it's still very much effective. It's not broken as it used to be, but it's very much effective. Now for the equipment, I'm also using a Lordsorn Blood Straight Sword. The reason for that being is that we have Bloody Slash in here. There's many enemies that to not bleed. And yes, we are scaling the damage of our bleeding, our base magic damage of the spell on itself, but sometimes it's a little bit better to just have a skill that you know that it's going to deal tremendous damage and that you can use point blank on the enemy. It's also amazing for exploration. It barely consumes FP. It consumes 6 points into FP, and I'd say that the Lord Thorn, it's perfect. The Lord Thorn sword, it's perfect because it doesn't require any strength, no dexterity. Virtually any class is going to have 10 and 10. I do have a little bit more because of my starting class, but if you started like I say mage or a cleric or things like that, then you shouldn't have to worry that much about being able to use this weapon or not. We're also using the maternal staff. This increases our sorcery damage by the sorcery scaling by increasing points into intelligence and arcane. We're also using the average armor, which increases by percentage base. I think that it's 2% per piece. The boots, they don't, so there's that. I'm using instead the Griefs of Solitude just to have that extra little bit of protection right there. The Talismans, we're using the Graven Mass Talisman. This increases the potency of our sorceries, and what do you know, we're actually using sorceries. This is a little bit of a concession. You can be using the Beloved Stardust, but that is going to increase the damage taken by quite a lot. Although it's somewhat of a long casting spell, so if you instead want to be using Radangon Icon for you to have a little bit more survivability, be my guest. All throughout the rendition of the gameplay you saw me using the Beloved Stardust. You can still very much survive with this thing. It's just going to be a little bit trickier. We're using the Shadow of Alexander. That's a concession as well. A lot of this is up to your personal preference and it's tailored to your tastes, but the Shadow of Alexander increases our damage quite substantially for our Bloody Slash, which we actually do use quite a lot. It's a very powerful tool to have in our arsenal right here. We're using the Arsenal Charm mainly for me to be able to use the Griefs of Solitude, but in here you can also exchange it for something different, like more stamina or Earth's Favor, or something that would increase your magic damage, like Magic Scorpion Charm, although I do not advise for you to combine that with the Beloved Stardust, because all of them already increase the damage that you take from the enemy, so you would be even much more of a Crystal Cannon. And like I said, this is effective now, this is very powerful, but it has been nerfed, so it's not like the Glass Cannon that it could potentially be prior to patch. It's still usable, it's still very powerful, it's just not as before. Mainly the two spells that you're going to be using, you're going to be spamming the Impenetrable Thorns right here. They deal quite a bit of base damage, and like you were able to see, we're building the base damage in these things because there's many enemies out there in the game that don't actually bleed. Like for example the kind of Minotaur, or like the ball, the star ball, that kind of little thingy that you saw me either fighting right now or you'll see it later. It's just that it's going to increase the magic base damage of everything by increasing our magic damage with, for example, Terra Magica. Terra Magica is going to increase our magic damage by 20%, and all of our build and our spells that we're using actually increase our magic damage by quite a lot. Now for the mix of wondrous physiques, you can be using, for example, the Magic Shrouding Cracked Tier. The Magic Shrouding Cracked Tier increases your damage by 20%. And also, since we are a low level character and we actually don't have that much intelligence, you can, for example, be using the Intelligence Not Crystal Tier to increase the scaling of the sorcery scaling of our staff right here, which is going to increase the base damage of the Impenetrable Thorns, but it's going to be the base damage, right? So it's not going to be the bleeding. So yes, it got nerfed. It was something needed. It was something very broken, I'd say. Everyone knew that this was going to happen, but that doesn't mean, like for example, like people usually loves to say, that this is trash now, that it doesn't work. It's not broken as before, it's still viable, it's still very much usable. You have seen me all throughout the rendition of the gameplay. It still deals tremendous amounts of damage. It still does insta-cast for bleeding, and the base damage of the spell in itself, it's not that bad. It's not that amazing as it used to be, so more often than not, if you're fighting something that it's resistant to bleeding or that it doesn't bleed, if you notice that you're not dealing enough damage, then that's why you have the Bloody Slash, because the Bloody Slash, it's usually going to deal from 4 to 5k damage depending on situations and resistances and what have you. So you do have extra tools to have right here. So remember that everything that we did to buff the magic portion of the spell is to increase the base damage of the spell, and you would be able to see all throughout the rendition of the gameplay that when we're not dealing like that big chunk of damage, but the damage was still decent, it was just the basic damage of the spell doing its job, and more often than not, those huge chunks of health that you see taking the enemy takes, that's when the bleeding is proccing. So yeah, it's still very much viable. It's a fun build to make, and if you're a higher level character, it's very, very rewarding as well. It's by all means not trash, but it's not as broken as it used to be. Anyways, if you like the content, like and the super appreciate it. And also, you that you're a gorgeous and beautiful person, you're indeed a gorgeous and beautiful person, subscribe to the channel, join the Discord, like the video. Have a great day.